Welcome, everyone. I'm Steve Farrell, the Worldwide Executive Director for Humanities Team, and I'm super excited to be here with you for this program called Trauma, Karma, and Collective Wisdom, exploring the leading edge of healing. This online event is with acclaimed spiritual healer Thomas Hübl. As we get started, I'm going to give Thomas a proper introduction. Thomas Hübl was born in Vienna, Austria, and studied medicine for several years before abandoning his studies to spend 4 years in retreat, devoting himself to meditation and leading to a fundamental and revelatory opening. In the years since then, Thomas has become known internationally as a modern mystic and spiritual teacher, whose work integrates the core insights of the great wisdom traditions with the discoveries of contemporary science, illuminating both with his profound understanding. And welcome to the program, Thomas. Great to have you with us.
Oh, thank you, Steve. I'm very happy that we're doing this together.
All right, me too. Been looking forward to this. And before we dive in with Thomas, I want to also let you know that near the end of this program, we're going to be telling you about our 8-week master's program that we've been working on for over a year. It features Thomas Hübl and Joan Borysenko and draws on their leading edge of research and discovery. It is groundbreaking, as you will see, and more on that later. Now, let's jump right in with Thomas to get to these exciting topics that we planned for you during the hour. And so Thomas, can you talk to me about the nature of personal trauma as we get started?
Well, let's start, first of all, say that trauma, like often when we hear trauma, we think of a car accident, or we hear whatever, like something that's connected to an event that happens to us. And maybe we define trauma for our conversation as the internal response to an overwhelming situation. So it means that life is actually very intelligent. And life over the course of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years learned that when there are overwhelming impacts, how to deal with those impacts in a way so that the survival is more secured, and that maybe staying in a place of action and choice. So when there is an overwhelming situation, an impact that cannot be processed in that moment, we have the capacity to, in a way, split off a part of our the overloaded part of our nervous system, in order for the rest of our nervous system to be in a functional place. But of course, that's only a short-term solution in a way, because it has consequences. But in that moment, it's a very intelligent choice. So there's a choice that's being made, and that's a very important point. And secondly, the after effects always go back to an intelligent action. Because often we see or we feel in our life the suffering that comes from trauma. We feel the after effects, that we are easily triggered, that we are easily stressed, that we find certain parts of our lives, certain situations, certain people, certain global issues as very difficult or problematic. Sometimes we feel disembodied, or we feel numb because there's one part in our nervous system that gets shut down, and another part is very stressed. So we feel that overactivation, and we feel also the numbness. That's why it's hard for us to relate to certain situations. So trauma also limits our capacity to relate to ourselves and to life around us. And that's often very difficult for us. We call it difficult, but we are suffering. And so in the last decades, I think trauma science, in a way, starts to reveal more the kind of physiological and the neuroscience aspects, the impacts on our bodies, on our health, on our ways of creating society. And later we're going to talk about a bit about a collective dimension of trauma. So, but in the ancient wisdom traditions, you know, when we talk about karma, one part of karma equals trauma. And so it's very interesting that it didn't start only now. Like people who were deeply concerned with life and exploring the depth of life, in a way, kind of revealed the nature of trauma already thousands of years ago. And also many civilizations or cultures tried to find healing modalities in order to deal with the after effects of trauma. So it's something that is kind of deeply ingrained in human history, and it comes with a feeling of separation, of feeling removed, of feeling kind of fragmented, holding back, being overreactive. And it's a big thing in our life when we, as long as we don't know what it's related to, we just see the symptoms. But once we are more trauma informed and we start to kind of track the roots of shock trauma, of attachment trauma that happens in many attachment processes between parents and their children, of course through abuse, violence, and then transgenerational trauma and cultural trauma. And I believe that in a serious spiritual practice and in a serious human development process, I believe to be able to know about, learn to integrate and heal and transcend the traumatization that we personally carry or we carry in a larger context within us is very important. So that's why we made it also at least one more key element of our conversation and of our mutual exploration in general.
Yeah, boy, what a good place to start. That really sets the table here as we go down deeper now into this. So as we talk about then the collective dimension to trauma, sometimes that people are born into, how does that work?
Yeah, so my I think I'm running groups now worldwide, and I think it started 17 years ago or something like that. And then, of course, at the beginning, my group started off in Europe, mainly also in Germany, and there was something, and I wasn't really looking out for collective trauma, although I mean it's apparent that in Germany there is a big wound that is very recent in history. And it also turned out that in many of my groups that were pretty fast, kind of large groups, I had often these massive eruptions of many people within the group. Like often it happened after the third, fourth, fifth day of a retreat, that this massive eruption of collective unconscious material started to happen. And that the first time I saw it, it was wow, it was a big thing. It took us 2 or 3 days to process through it. And then after some time, because it came back again and again, of course I said, okay, so life is showing me something, and I started to study that. And then it led me to work, Holocaust work between, like in Germany, and then also Germany and Israel, and I ran retreats in Israel, and then we expanded it to the US and other places around the world. Because through all those retreats, I learned, wow, so we are talking about individual trauma, but actually in many places around the world, there are massive collective scars in the collective body that are not only, they are individual traumatizations, but there is also like a commonality. There is something in the experience of a whole culture going through a war, going through a dictatorship, going through genocide and violence, that there is a shared dimension, there's a cultural dimension of trauma. And often those impacts are so strong, like for example, what's happening right now in Syria is a very deep cultural trauma that is happening right now as we speak. And so that's gonna take generations to be digested. And digestion is actually a very important word here, because a lot of the spiritual practice is to digest the undigested part of life. karma is postponed energy. It's postponed experience. It's postponed information. And so we push some part of life, we cannot process it, so we push it out of the screen. But one day it will need to come back, and it will need to be processed because it's energy that has been created. And when it's been created, it needs to fulfill itself, like the Enzo in the Zen tradition, until it returns into nothing, back into peace. So presence is isness. Presence is. It's being, people call it being in the moment, but it's more than being just in this moment in time. It's being deeply present, means to be able to be. Undigested information are thoughts, feelings, body sensations, inner processes that overshadow presence. And that's why many people don't feel like resting in a state of inner peace. And that inner peace, that capacity to really be quiet and still and tranquil and be nourished in a very deep, deep place inside, for many people got lost. And so we are trying to find answers in more superficial places within ourselves that are more fragmented. That's why we walk around with a lot of questions. And so then I realized, wow, for the spiritual practice, it's very important to see that there's not only individual trauma, but there's a collective dimension. And many people that have been born after such a collective scar or wound happened, we have been born into a world that is already very traumatized, which means that world for us is the world. The traumatized world seems to be normal because many of the symptoms that we see, we grew up in, we deeply carry inside epigenetically, psychologically, like socially. We have been imprinted by a world that is hurt. But not all the symptoms that we see, we call a wound. And I believe it's like walking around with a big inflammation, and then all the time wonder, or with a big wound, and then we all the time ask, oh, why do I constantly have inflammations? Yeah, but if we don't know that a wound needs to be treated as a wound, and it needs to be, you need to put band-aids, or you need to cover a wound in order not to get inflamed all the time, that if we don't do that, we will constantly have infections, and maybe some of them can be really severe. And I believe collective trauma, for many people that have been born after those catastrophes, we see social symptoms, political symptoms, health symptoms, all kinds of symptoms in the world that look like, oh, that's the world. That the massive degree of separation, because enlightenment is the return to the natural state, not to the extraordinary. Unification is the most underlying state. But because we know the fragmented world, our nervous systems grew up in fragmented worlds, more or less fragmented worlds. So we learned that that's the world, how it is. And I believe, so there's a much bigger ghost in the room, which is the collective ghost. And if that's the ghost of slavery, or of the Native American genocide, or if that's the Holocaust, or if that's the dictatorships or other genocides or wars, we find them all around the world. So the planetary body has lots of scars. And I believe individual traumatization goes most of the time back to a whole trauma net that is transmitted throughout the generations. And also science shows more and more how epigenetic changes happen through trauma and how trauma is being passed on. And that's also what the traditions, the wisdom traditions say. And I believe healing is going to go to a much wider collective level now, also because now we have technology, we became a global village, And I think there are many signs at the moment that we have to deal with the collective dimension of trauma in order to solve certain issues, like, for example, climate change. So I think it's a very, very important topic, and it's actually the threshold into a new, more collective we-space healing that we need to develop tools for. And I think it's upon us to hear this call and to be part of its development.